Hello, welcome to Cinelit. My name is Adam Marsh. Today's episode is part 2 of our wide-ranging discussion on the New Hollywood movement of the 1960s, 70s and early 80s. Part 2, we are now discussing the fall of New Hollywood. Enjoy. I guess looking at Easy Rider and Apocalypse Now as the start and finish. But if we talked about freedom early on, as Becky brought up, the freedom to make the films was both the ignition and the fuel of New Hollywood, but it's also the death of New Hollywood as well. Because at the start, you've got the freedom to make The Godfather, you get the freedom to make Easy Rider. Easy Rider, perfect. You got the freedom to make Easy Rider for £100,000. Whereas in the early 80s, you got the freedom to make One from the Heart for $40 million or whatever the budget was for that.
And build your own studio.
And build your own studio for what is essentially a small-scale musical, you know. So I think the potential risks go alongside Hollywood not feeling like they know what makes money anymore. And I think at the start of New Hollywood, not knowing what makes money, but then these guys coming on, well, we know what makes money. Give us £100,000, I'll make you £1 million profit. The 80s boom period where you had high concept ideas led to some very, very strange movies getting made because Hollywood just didn't know what was right. You know, what was worse. So you had things like E.T. and Back to the Future, you know, which were high concept ideas, and then you also had things like The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension, where you just like, what the hell?
All of those films were risks, really.
Exactly, yeah.
Who knew that Back to the Future and E.T. were going to take off?
Well,
they could have, Buckaroo Banzai could have caught on.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly right. Yes. So when Francis Ford Coppola goes to the studio and goes, give me £40 million to make this musical, it's like, okay, well, he's got a track record, great, no problem, here's the money, let's make more money.
Yeah. Some of this, I think, as well, is to do with the fact that I don't know the history of drugs in old Hollywood. I'm sure there's plenty, but you know,
sounds like a book, that.
Yeah, my perception is, you know, Hopper and Fonda and people and Bruce Dern have sort of brought LSD into Hollywood sort of under the radar, you know, but Hollywood's drug of choice has then gradually become cocaine, and that is where you're then getting these. Oh yeah, Michael Cimino will give you $50 million, and you can move that tree, you know, 300 yards if you want to, and it'll cost $100,000, and we'll do it, you know. I think it is that procession from one drug to another may have had some influence on all of that.
That's an interesting angle to take on the history of Hollywood there, isn't it?
Is it also as well, do you think, maybe the studio again getting back involved and taking control when really they're not the people that should be in charge?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's just proving the fact that the hippies being in charge is never a good idea. Even their own films say it's not a good idea.
Yeah, it's kind of like the grassroots of it was like they knew what they were doing, but it started snowballing into the fact of what the grassroots of it was this, you know, anti-establishment, and it's starting now to become again a money machine again.
So moving on to that then, because it's one of the other things that probably people don't think about as New Hollywood, but forms part of it. It's not just your art house films. It's not just your classic cinema, Hollywood cinema, and making great stories and LSD inspired road movies and things like that. You've also got the filmmakers that are enamoured with other filmmakers. So you got the movie brats. Brats. So you got like Scorsese, Coppola, people like that.
George
Lucas, Steven Spielberg as I guess the two that you could argue have had the most impact on the way cinema went from the mid-70s. With the introduction of the classic blockbuster, I guess, now with people queuing around the block to see these films.
So we're at that point now where, you know, you're in sort of 1977 or 78, and every good film that you go and see has got a reference to John Ford's The Searchers in it.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing. It's like instead of referencing Antonioni, you're referencing John Ford now.
You know, you've got Paul Schrader writing Taxi Driver and then writing and directing Hardcore, which are both both basically remakes of The Searchers. George Lucas rips off at least one major set piece from The Searchers in Star Wars, you know, and the whole sensibility of Star Wars and the whole sort of desert setting of it, you know, it sort of reflects that particular movie. And that's just one example, you know. The Searchers is one of these films that seem to have caught on with this generation, but there are others, and you'll see them repeated time and time again in these films. But it's great, you know. It's really good in terms of all these years on now. If you're trying to teach people about film, and this is what, you know, the Cine Lit idea is all about. It's great to be able to take a Star Wars fan, someone who loves Rogue One or whatever, and has seen the early trilogy, and to be able to sit them down and say, oh yeah, this bit's taken from John Ford, this is taken from Kurosawa, you know, and maybe just spark something off and get them interested in those other directors and see who George Lucas's influences were. Yeah. So it's very interesting from an educational point of view. Or I love the idea that people self-educate on film, that you can go onto Netflix or you can rent a bunch of Blu-rays or whatever, and you can actually read up on this, and you can read who Spielberg's influences are, and you can then go and seek them out for yourself. And I think that's a fascinating sort of legacy from this whole period.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the idea of history runs through New Hollywood, which is kind of strange when you think about like a lot of movements like this in other areas. It's burn the past, build a new. You know, you got a punk movement in music. You know, screw all that rubbish. It's terrible. New. But with this
embraced it.
This embraces the past and twists it and makes it their own, which I think is a fascinating take on it. I guess.
Well, it's taking a film like The Searchers and saying, hey, you know, John Ford made this Western. John Wayne. Everyone went to see this big John Wayne film in 1955. But what it's actually about is the same concerns that we've got in the hippie movement. You know, we're taking that from it, and we're interpreting the film in that particular way, and we're going to make our own versions of it. You know, set in squalid New York or squalid Los Angeles, and that's The Searchers is a great example. You know, for anyone who's interested in sort of tracing these influences on these 70s films. You know, The Searchers is the sort of key go-to sort of movie text, but yeah, there are plenty of others, and you'll see a lot of other films reflected in the work of you know, Coppola, Scorsese, all the people we've mentioned. De Palma being perhaps the big one.
Very influenced by Italian giallo thrillers.
But also by Blow Up and which again had its.
I would incorporate Blow Up as an Italian giallo thriller.
That sort of sits outside the giallo, but with a huge influence on it. Yeah. De Palma is influenced by those sort of Italian European thrillers, but also he brings in sort of conspiracy elements and things. And he does this mixture, you know, which is great. And you can tell he's been watching the French New Wave too, and his films manage to sort of mingle all of this together, which makes for remarkable entertainment. And then the weird thing that then happens with subsequent generations is they get influenced by what they've seen in Scorsese and Coppola and De Palma and George Lucas films, perhaps without knowing the influences and only finding those out later.
Well, I mean, that's one that I guess that's one of the problems, is without knowing the context of where the influences are coming from, are people trying to not remake somewhere, but take influence from the wrong parts of what made Jaws a great movie, what made Star Wars a great movie, rather than what made Jaws a great success and what made Star Wars a great success. You know, they're trying to find the reason why Star Wars made X amount of millions at the box office. Why did Jaws make loads of money? Why were people literally queuing around, busting the block to get to see this film? They're looking for those reasons, I guess, which is why you could level the argument that the release of Jaws rang the death knell for New Hollywood. If you want to look at it in a really pessimistic kind of way.
Yeah, well, that's what I think. Because obviously, when they were making like Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde and things like that, they weren't necessarily thinking, "Oh, this is going to make loads of money." And you know, the independent films, they must have been aware that this is not going to be a big, huge success. You're making it for a different reason. But as soon as money comes involved, then the creative side of things start to take less priority. So yeah.
with all that said, there were some independent movies still being made through the late 70s with distinct voices. We talked about John Waters earlier, and his particular brand of bad taste cinema was making inroads into late night shows and making money and giving him a career for a start.
Yeah,
and Divine as well.
Yeah, indeed, and you know, some on the notes that you've prepared, Adam, you've mentioned there's people like Ralph Bakshi as well, who's doing controversial animated feature films, and then you've got the whole there's the blaxploitation thing going on, which is something sort of that happens around the same time and has got its own particular concerns in terms of protest. But you've also got voices like Melvin Van Peebles and people like that who are making more serious films on those sort of themes, like Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, which
he couldn't get fined. He had a 3-picture deal with, I think, Universal. He had a 3-picture deal with Universal, but they wouldn't fund Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, so he had to get a loan from Bill Cosby of all people to make this movie. So the independent spirit was still alive, particularly in blaxploitation films. They were making them in many cases independently. So it embodies New Hollywood in that respect, definitely. And then like Bakshi in the animation world and culture world.
I think it's the age of the filmmakers, the fact that they're young people primarily making them or starring in them, you know. And it's the shared theme, the community that was going to see the blaxploitation movies and the hippie sort of thing that was going on around Haight-Ashbury and places had the same concerns, you know, that they all mistrusted the police, you know, none of them wanted to go to Vietnam. And the fact that you've got these two different sets of films, they actually do sort of lace together, you know. And again, Roger Corman, again, is right there. You know, AIP are right there. They're making all the blaxploitation stuff, you know. Samuel Z. Arkoff's raking in the dollars from those films. And Jack Hill, again, is a white director, is directing a lot of them. So yeah.
Don't forget Larry Cohen in this mix as well.
Larry Cohen. Another. Well, he's like Romero. He's making horror films primarily. He did do, you know, one or two other little sidelines, Private Files of J. Edgar Hoover and things like that, which is a brilliant film. But yeah, he's primarily making horror movies, but they've got something to say, and they've got something to say about 70s America, you know.
I think that's one of the key things coming out of most is like nearly all the films have got something to say.
Yeah.
You know, there's
and on subjects that the audience would understand and that would be affecting the audience directly.
Yeah, if any decade had lots of things for people to be talking about, it was a great decade for that.
Oh, yeah. It is. It's all about trust issues. It's all about, you know, being forced to do things you don't want to do. It's about the man, you know, and
the man.
to use that great 70s phrase, you know. And yeah, there's a lot of shared communities there who've got these sort of shared visions, but they're all off doing their own little pockets of film. But yeah, often all under the banner of American International Pictures.
Maybe we got it wrong. It's not Jack Nicholson. It's not Warren Beatty. It's not Roger Corman. It's AIP.
Yeah, it's James Nicholson.
Yeah, it's James Nicholson. Yeah. So we've got blockbusters booming. Hollywood, they're making more money. Their budgets are going higher and higher. It can only keep going positive and upbeat and continue making more and more money. Surely that's the only way to go, isn't it?
Audiences stopped going to see the film, so
that's it.
That's simply it. Yeah.
That is literally it, isn't it?
Nobody wanted to see Heaven's Gate.
Yeah. So we talked about some of those key moments that initiated the downfall. I guess we think that's Jaws making New Hollywood films have to make. I guess before that, Exorcist. As part of that, and The Godfather, in some ways, they made so much money and were so critically acclaimed that even when you get to 79 and Apocalypse Now was a success, it could have easily been a massive failure, that film. You know, it could have been The Heaven's Gate.
That flopped,
exactly, it could have been that one. The fact that it wasn't is frankly remarkable, really. Look at the history of that movie. You know, it's frankly remarkable that didn't bring down all Hollywood, you know, and so it kind of eats through into the early 80s without a major flop that really ruined the credibility. I mean, you had 1941 in the late 70s, which was Spielberg's follow-up to Jaws?
Close Encounters.
Follow-up to Close Encounters, which was a massive flop. but equally could have been seen as like, I guess if you were looking at it from a point of view of a historical point of view, it wasn't a new Hollywood film, and its design, its setup, in everything that it was. It was like a caper movie. It was a pastiche movie. It was a broad comedy movie like Hollywood used to make.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, Adam.
Yeah.
I was just going to sort of jump in and say what you've got here is, instead of being influenced by The Searchers and by film and by old Hitchcock movies and stuff, they're actually now starting to try and remake those or recapture.
Because you had a couple, you had like What's Up Doc by Peter Bogdanovich, which was basically a remake of a classic
screwball
comedy. And I guess you got things like The Long Goodbye.
Yeah.
Robert Altman, again, which is slightly different because he did bring something to that.
Yeah.
But essentially, it was remaking an old
classic film.
Classic noir,
which The Big Lebowski then did again 20 years later.
Yeah. So you have those Hollywood directors not just content with referencing, content with like bringing their takes to those classic movies. You have them basically remaking stuff, which again maybe is the beginning of the end in that respect. So we can blame it all on What's Up Doc.
Maybe. It took.
That's my take on it.
Maybe took 10 years for that to sort of filter through. But perhaps that's the first little domino that you pull out of the pile. Yeah.
Or maybe it's that remakes and sequels don't work. It's not. That's not the.
I think most of Hollywood now would disagree with that.
But the thing is, with these films, they weren't direct remakes. They were sort of inspired by. It was like New York is like Martin Scorsese. He's not remaking a Vincente Minnelli musical, but he's doing his own version of one. Getting Vincente's daughter to star in it. So. But. What's interesting about it, again, the list of films that Adam's prepared for us here to talk about this little section. 40 years on now from these, I love every single film in that list. and I maybe didn't when I went to see them at the time.
I guess that's context. I guess what you're being marketed to at the time influences you, even if you're not somebody who gets influenced by marketing. And I think maybe reviews maybe have influenced those times. Because some of the reviews that came out around those films were pretty damning.
Oh, with Popeye in particular, which I wanted to talk about, which you've cited here. Robert Altman was an interesting figure on this scene because he was older than most of the filmmakers, and he was too old to be a hippie. And he wouldn't have wanted to be anyway. I don't think
he doesn't seem to fit the sensibility either. Massively.
No. He went off and did his own thing, and he sort of protested and had freedom to keep coming back to these words we've been using. He did all of that in his own way. He got his own sort of idiosyncratic sort of way of doing things and way of presenting his subjects. And he's still a very anti-establishment filmmaker, working for the establishment, working for the main studios, and I mean, he's right at the core of all this because he did an acid western. He did McCabe and Mrs. Miller. He was doing some very controversial films. He'd done Thieves Like Us, which was a remake of a classic film noir sort of Lovers on the Run movie. And then Popeye for me is his masterpiece. I think it's great. I can't remember which writer this was, but there was a writer some years ago who suggested that, because Altman was churning out movies, he was doing like 2 a year, and he did this great science fiction film, really good sort of apocalyptic science fiction movie with Paul Newman called Quintet. And at the end of that film, Newman's character, who sort of survived this ordeal throughout the movie in this very sort of wintry, white, bleak setting, just wanders off and disappears. And somebody pointed out that what we see at the start of Popeye is a tiny character in a tiny little boat with the sea raging around him, coming out of nowhere and sailing into the port of Sweet Haven. And they said, is it Paul Newman? Has Paul Newman's character from Quintet transmogrified into Robin Williams? And I thought that was a fascinating sort of take on it. And I've always read Popeye now as being
a continuation of that
Quintet Part 2. And I think it really works as that. It's if you see the character of Popeye, don't judge it as all the critics did of, it's not like the old cartoons, it's not like the old sort of King Features syndicate things, all the stuff we read in newspapers, you know. It's this guy from Morecambe Mindy who's got these fake arms on and he looks terrible and his performance isn't all that good, and Altman's really messed up this time. It's easy to do that. It's easy to judge Popeye at face value and say, it doesn't work, it's not a good film. Which audience was it aimed at? That was another thing. Because it was famously the first Disney film to have scenes set in a brothel, you know, and things like that. And it was like, we can't take the kids to this, but we don't want to go and see it either. You know?
Well, that's the fascinating thing about a lot of 80s films have issues with that. Who is it aimed at, you know?
Well, again, that's down to, I think the filmmakers just got maybe too indulgent, don't you think? Yeah. And lost sight of their audience, is that a thing?
Yeah.
I think Popeye's fascinating because I think now I don't think most people. Do you mean, Becky? Do you have an image of what Popeye is from growing up?
The cartoons.
No, cartoons when you were a kid.
The cartoons are still coming on when I was a kid. Yeah, and when I first saw Popeye, the film, I didn't like it either, but
yeah. As I remember, what was interesting was when Robin Williams died, the film that people contacted you about
it
was Popeye.
It was. Well, yes, it was. Well, I say people. It was definitely one person repeatedly contacting me over and over and over and over again about showing a tribute scene.
And it wasn't me.
And it wasn't Darryl, no. It was. So we screened Popeye, and we did a fairly good audience for it in the wake of Robin Williams' death, sadly. But it's certainly a curiosity as a film. And you can see why it crashed and burned.
And although Altman may not necessarily fit into New Hollywood in the sense that he's not part of the gang, you know, Popeye very definitely fits into this little group of disasters that killed it all. Yeah.
I think Altman's a fascinating one because I think he brings something that I guess many of the other ones, maybe Coppola does, but the idea of the ensemble cast as being a kay feature of
which he carried on doing right to the end
exactly.
Of his career,
He was arguably the master of that. Pret-a-Porter, kickstarted with MASH. Early on in the late 60s, early 70s.
And even influential now, because of course he worked with Julian Fellows, who's got his new TV series starting up. And had Altman's movie with Fellows not been a hit, you know.
Yeah, Gosford Park,
we might not have Belgravia starting on TV.
Yeah, or Downton Abbey. Or any... You're not selling it to me now, actually, Darryl.
Well, I'm just pointing out, you know, the influence beyond the grave, you know. And that ensemble cast thing has obviously sort of filtered through, and Fellows has sort of thought, this is something that I like doing, you know. And that comes from, I mean, he'd written the script and sort of pitched it to Altman. Altman sort of, this is my kind of thing, you know, this is what I do.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how that's now carrying on into the British mainstream, into our mainstream TV.
Yeah.
And how many people tuning in for Belgravia will think about Robert Altman and about New Hollywood when they're watching it? You know?
Well, I guess not a lot, but equally, I guess maybe Robert Altman was influenced by television as well, because television has more of an ensemble cast feel to it anyway, because you've got X amount of episodes being made, you need to be able to focus on different characters, so maybe it's just a circle completing itself in some ways. Yeah. But yes, Popeye, but again, feeding back into sort of like the big disasters around that period, and also maybe the remakes of other stuff, because like Sorcerer's in there, which is a great movie, but a remake of Wages of Fear.
Yeah. And got panned at the time.
Absolutely.
And the big thing with Sorcerer was that everyone thought it was going to be a horror movie because it was coming out after The Exorcist.
Yeah.
You know, it was Friedkin's next film, and it's called Sorcerer.
Exactly. Yeah.
And people didn't get the film they wanted. And people who did know what it was thought it's not as good as The Wages of Fear.
Yeah.
What you're starting to get now is people saying, we actually think it's better than Wages of Fear. I've heard that a few times, and I think they're about.
I think they're both very, very good. That's all I'm going to say on the matter. That's all I got to say about
that. But another film of that era and of that little group of films that are perceived as being the ones that killed this whole scene off and almost destroyed Hollywood in toto, you know, and yet now it's seen as being a classic.
Well, you re-released a couple of years ago in UK cinemas.
It's a massive thing as well. Yeah.
So I guess you got other ones. I mean, the biggies. The biggies that were mentioned around this period is Heaven's Gate.
Yeah.
Michael
One that's not on your list, which I mentioned earlier, is the Blues Brothers.
Was that a flop? I thought it was a big success.
It was a big success, which is maybe why you've not put it on there. But it was certainly indicative of this sort of bloating.
Definitely the bloating, but I still
suppose
put
it's it's the exception.
It's the apocalypse now of car chase movies, I guess, if you want to look at it that way.
And again, John Landis is another figure who was sort of around and skirted around this scene and was starting out and making films at the same time as all these guys, but never really sort of associated with them. He was another John Waters. He was off doing his own
I think
thing.
Dante as well. Joe Dante is part of that, whereas there but not there, you know.
And they all link up with Spielberg and people sort of into after this is all over. In the mid-'80s, you've got these guys making films together, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And once all the fallout's happened, you know, we can be mates now, you know, and we love each other's films, and here's $250 million, let's go and make another one, you know.
Yeah. I guess in obviously Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino was a very public one where it almost brought down the entire studio. And then you've got One from the Heart, Francis Ford Coppola's massively voted musical. And then one that you was mentioning as Reds, which was
Warren Beatty, Peter Biskin's favourite,
So that movie was critically acclaimed. So it wasn't a critical flop like a lot of the other ones were, but it does signal the end of a sort of like era in the sense of like giving that freedom to a filmmaker.
What's interesting about Reds is it fits into the new Hollywood thing, and it fits into that sense of a filmmaker being allowed to do what he wants to do. But again, it harks back to this idea that what Warren Beatty wanted to do there was basically sort of make his Dr. Zhivago. There have been films since Reds that are longer, and there have been films that have been done on sort of epic themes. But really, I think Reds is the last of its kind. It's the last of that great old-fashioned old Hollywood. It's sort of got one foot in old Hollywood and one in new Hollywood. It's the last of those great old Hollywood historical epics. And again, another film that I loved it at the time. I was a fan from day one. It was my favourite film of the year when it came out. I saw it aged sort of 19, and I thought, this is just brilliant, you know, it blew me away. 40 years on, I think it's even better. So yeah, maybe Biskind is onto something with Warren Beatty.
Yeah, we've convinced ourselves over the course of
but again, look at Beatty's career since. He seems to make a film every 15 years, or he's done very little since. You know.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember him from Dick Tracy growing up. He was Dick Tracy.
And what was the politician thing where he became a rapper, Bulworth?
Oh, Bulworth, He did Bugsy as well.
Yes.
So
that's been about it, really.
Yeah,
you know.
The rules don't apply. Was it last year?
Yeah, and
crashed and burned. I think.
It's weird how he's sort of taken this back seat as though the failure of Reds really burned him. You know.
I mean, he did Ishtar, didn't he, as well, which is another massive epic failure as well.
That may have contributed as well. That probably more than Reds is the... And again, what's Ishtar if it's not an attempt to do one of those old Bob Hope, Bing Crosby movies on a budget more than they all cost put together, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so I feel like I covered most of New Hollywood. Is there anything that we've missed that we think we should highlight? There's a couple of names I think we've probably missed out. A couple of areas anyway, particularly the idea of the road movie and the existential road movie in the early 70s, where you get things like Vanishing Point, Two Blame Blacktop, Monty Hellman, who again...
This all sort of ties in with the acid western. Again, there are sort of concerns shared there, and they're sort of weird. It's taking the American road, and it's making it into a metaphor in the way that the acid western was sort of playing around with conventional western ideas. Very interesting as a sort of parallel thing that was going on in American cinema that maybe wouldn't have happened without Easy Rider.
No, and I guess that's sort of like the idea of the road as being a search for the self in those movies, a search for the hidden heart of America.
Which harks back to the Searchers again, and
absolutely,
back to the classic Western.
I guess that kind of started to go away when you had things like Jewel and our friend John Smith's not going to thank me on this one, but The Driver, where they took the road movie and said, actually, no, we can just do something really cool and crimey with it rather than make it more, make it about a search for the self, make it more about...
But again, wouldn't The Driver in particular fit into the French New Wave to bring it all back?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And I guess the other for me, the other one, and again, to carry on the road theme, the idea of the disappearing line in the road being a trait of those movies definitely continues in the career of David Lynch. And he had his start in the late 70s with like Eraserhead, and then Oscar nominated for The Elephant Man, which is getting re-released fairly soon in the UK cinemas. Again, another director on the fringes of the new Hollywood scene.
Yeah.
You know, not quite in it, but not quite.
He was the guy who did the first tribute to these 1981-82 disasters in Making June a couple of years later.
yeah.
It's like, you think you guys have messed up, wait till you see this, you know.
Yeah. Well, I guess the last word on that went to Brian De Palma. I think with Bonfire of the Vanities in 1990, I guess that was the final death nail in that whole new Hollywood directors flopping at the box office. Cool. Yes, I mean those are the two that I felt we should bring out.
I wanted to throw in Hal Ashby as well.
Oh, of course,
who I think was for me, he's my favourite American director of that period, and yet he's like Altman. He sits above it sort of. He's doing his own thing. But there's this run of films: The Landlord, Harold and Maude, Last Detail, Bound for Glory, Shampoo, Coming Home, and Being There. You know, just 7.
All including lots of the actors that we have just been talking about. Jack Nicholson,
exactly.
Warren Beatty,
so there's Ashby's sort of got one foot in the scene and one. It's as though he's sort of watching it from outside and cherry picking the best bits of it. You know, and Bruce Dern's in Coming Home and
Robin Williams in what was the Hal Ashby? Robin Williams Hal Ashby 90s film. Anyway, Mark Freddick.
He's in there anyway. So Ashby, I think, is another one of these interesting figures like Altman, who was sort of just removed from it a little bit, but was around at the same time and occasionally dipping in to the pool and picking out a Jack Nicholson or someone, and again addressing a lot of the same concerns, but maybe from a slightly older, slightly more reserved sort of perspective. Not so concerned about whether hippies got what they wanted, because he didn't really care, you know. But making this run of just flawless films in the 70s, I'd say, you know, there were a number of directors who had great runs during that time. I think Ashby's is up there with anyone's, you know, in terms of quality.
We also talked about like Don Siegel earlier on. He had a bit of a renaissance in that period. And Sam Peckinpah and people like that.
Well, this brings in the name Clint Eastwood.
And Clint Eastwood, yeah.
Who, again, you know, Clint's often seen as being a sort of establishment figure and a bit of a right-wing sort of figure. But you look at the subject matter of those films that he was making at the time of New Hollywood. He's got one eye on that as well, you know.
He does, yeah. But when you do a whole Republican convention where you talk to a chair, it's hard to really get beyond that, isn't it? But yeah, you're right. I mean, and equally, he was coming out of that spaghetti western, the Italian western genre in the 60s, which again had a massive influence on acid westerns and in the New Hollywood itself. So
then you look at, you know, the team up with Siegel, the films he did with him, are fascinating, and certainly in this sort of context, you know, where you've got Coogan's Bluff, which has actually got a hippie sequence in it. It's got a great sort of you know, acid party in some crazy nightclub with an amazing band on stage and go-go dancers everywhere, you know. And then you know, you look at the films are quite diverse, actually. You know, you've got Play Misty for Me, and you've got Dirty Harry around this time. And they're all different from each other, but they all sort of connect in a way to some of the themes that you know, Dennis Hopper and people are dealing with, you know. Maybe, again, from an askew sort of viewpoint, from Siegel or from Clint Eastwood's own particular viewpoint. But yeah, very interesting. The fact that there are a lot of these films around that aren't necessarily new Hollywood, but they're clearly sort of tied to it or influenced by it. And I think it all makes for a fascinating period in American film history.
Yeah, and another film that I was thinking, just to go more back towards the beginning, you know, in the sense of, I do think this is one of the most important times in the whole of, particularly American filmmaking, because it's just so much freedom, is Midnight Cowboy. And to think how that film was made so early on, I still feel is one to note as well.
Yeah, so that's what, 1969.
Yes, yeah.
Right in the midst of it. Well, that's another one you can put in that list with The Wild Bunch and Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah.
It's not a violent film like those.
No.
But it's sort of violent in its own way. It's got other things going on. It's violent, maybe the wrong word. Challenging is about.
I think it's
Yeah.
controversial is the wrong word either. But it's putting confrontational characters on the big screen that wouldn't have been in movies just 3 years before.
And that a lot of the audience is going to react against and isn't going to want to go and see a film about. You know.
Yeah.
No, great choice.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that pretty much wraps up New Hollywood. Thank you for joining us. Please check out our Facebook page for any more further details about us, and also we'll hopefully be putting up some episode notes for this particular episode on that Facebook page too. So we'll see you all next month.